December 22nd, 1941. The White House, Washington, D.C. Winston Churchill has been awake for 20 hours, and he is beginning to understand that the man across the table is going to determine the outcome of the war he has been fighting alone for 2 years. Churchill arrived in Washington 4 days after Pearl Harbor, aboard the battleship HMS Duke of York, after a rough Atlantic crossing that the 67-year-old Prime Minister had found physically demanding in ways he does not admit in his correspondence, and that his physician, Lord Moran, records in his diary with the clinical precision of a doctor who has learned that his patient does not welcome being told that he is showing his age. The trip is called the Arcadia Conference, and its purpose is to establish the joint command structure and the strategic priorities of the Anglo-American coalition that Pearl Harbor has created in a single December morning, and that Churchill, with the survivor's instinct of a man who has been managing this war's terrible arithmetic for 2.5 years, understands to be the thing that will save Britain and eventually end the war. The coalition is the thing. The American industrial economy is the thing. The American army that will eventually emerge from the American industrial economy and the American training programs is the thing. Churchill understands all of this with a clarity that the 2.5 years of managing the war without it have produced, and he has crossed the Atlantic in winter on a battleship at 67 with a heart that Lord Moran is privately monitoring more carefully than the Prime Minister would want, because the meeting at the White House is the meeting that the war has been waiting for. Churchill's public persona in December 1941 is the persona that history has preserved, the bulldog defiance, the absolute confidence in Allied eventual victory, the oratorical certainty that the English-speaking peoples together cannot be defeated, the specific and carefully crafted image of a man for whom doubt does not exist, because the cause is righteous and the alliance is invincible. The speeches have been magnificent. The speeches in the summer of 1940, when Britain stood alone, have been the specific instrument by which Churchill has sustained the national will that required sustaining, has converted the tactical disaster of Dunkirk into a psychological resource, has kept the British people and the British military and the British government oriented toward a future in which the war would eventually be won. The speeches require the specific public persona. Without it, they do not work. Churchill knows this. He has always known this. He is the most sophisticated communicator in the English-speaking world, possibly in the world, and he understands with a precision that few political leaders ever develop that the relationship between what a leader says and what a leader thinks is not a simple relationship of transparency, that the leader's public communication is an instrument that serves purposes beyond the simple conveyance of the leader's private assessment, and that the purposes served by his public communication about the American alliance require a public assessment of American military capability that his private assessment does not support in all its particulars. In private, Winston Churchill is something more complicated and more honest. He is a man who has been carrying a war that his country cannot win alone, who has been managing the morale of a nation and an empire while privately calculating the specific military and industrial resources that the calculations say are insufficient for the task, and who is looking across the table at Franklin Roosevelt and at the representatives of the American military establishment with a specific and carefully concealed calculation. How long will it take for what is across this table to become what the war requires, and can Britain survive the interval? What Churchill privately writes and says about American forces in the years that follow, in his correspondence with Roosevelt, that the Roosevelt Library and the British National Archives preserve, in his communications to Brooke, that Brooke's published diaries contain, in the specific form of a brilliant professional's honest record of his relationship with the most brilliant political leader he ever served, in the private conversations that John Colville records in his diaries, with the observational precision of a man who has been trained to notice what the principals around him are actually thinking, as distinct from what they are saying, is one of the most revealing documents of the Second World War's Anglo-American partnership, and it describes a private reality that Churchill's public communications about American power never quite capture. A man who needed American military force desperately, who doubted it initially at the highest professional level, who was gradually and genuinely converted by its performance, and who understood, by the end, that his country's survival depended on an ally whose military capacity he had privately underestimated, in ways that the Allies' actual performance made unmistakable. Churchill's private assessment of American forces in 1941 and early 1942 is shaped by a specific and honestly grounded skepticism that his 2 years of fighting the war without American participation has produced. He has seen what modern warfare at the highest level demands: the industrial capacity to sustain losses at the rates that the German military can impose, the organizational capacity to convert industrial output into military force at the rate the war's operational demands require, and the specific quality of military command and institutional preparation that allows a force to fight the German army without being repeatedly defeated in the process that the British Army has experienced. He knows that America has not yet demonstrated these capacities in their military application. He knows that the American army he is looking at in December 1941 has a strength of approximately 1.6 million men, most of them recently inducted and imperfectly trained, equipped with weapons systems that are still in the early phases of the production ramp-up that the 1940 and 1941 expansion programs have initiated, and led by an officer corps whose most recent major combat experience, the First World War, ended 23 years ago, and whose institutional preparation for the specific challenges of combined arms warfare against the German military has been conducted in the training exercises and theoretical preparations of peacetime rather than in the specific and irreplaceable crucible of actual combat against a first-class opponent. The American Army's senior officers in December 1941 are, with specific exceptions, men whose experience of combat is confined to the First World War, at the junior levels where that experience was accumulating, and who have spent the subsequent decades in the peacetime garrison, Army's specific institutional environment, promotion ladders governed by seniority rather than performance, training exercises whose constraints bear only an approximate relationship to the conditions of actual combat, and the specific intellectual conservatism of a military establishment that has not been required to transform itself by the experience of defeat, because it has not experienced defeat in the memory of its serving officers. Churchill knows all of this because his professional military advisors, and Brooke above all, have been gathering and assessing the available information about American military capability and have been providing him assessments that are, in the aggregate, consistent with his own estimation that America's potential is vast, that its actual military capability in December 1941 is limited, and that the interval between those two conditions represents a period of danger for the alliance that his strategic planning must somehow bridge. What Churchill says in public in December 1941 and through 1942 bears only a specific relationship to what he thinks in private. In public, he speaks of the great English-speaking peoples joined in the most righteous cause in human history, of the irresistible power of America's resources and spirit, of his absolute confidence in ultimate victory. In private, to Brooke, to his war cabinet, to the members of his personal staff who see him when the public persona is not operating, he says something different, something more honest, more anxious, and more specifically grounded in the military and industrial realities that his private intelligence gives him. The specific private admissions that Churchill makes about American forces through 1942, the admissions that appear in the Colville diaries, in the Brooke diaries, in the Churchill-Roosevelt correspondence, and in the War Cabinet papers that Churchill's own staff produced and preserved, concern three distinct subjects that his private communications address, at different levels of candor. Understanding these three subjects, and the specific evidence that Churchill's private communications provide about each, requires holding two things simultaneously: the specific historical reality of what Churchill actually said and thought, and the specific historical function of what his public pronouncements were designed to accomplish. The gap between those two things is not hypocrisy, in any conventional sense. It is the specific professional requirement of a wartime leader who needs his ally to feel valued and respected, while he simultaneously manages the private calculations that the Allies' current limitations require. The first subject is American military unreadiness, in the sense that Brooke's assessments had identified, and that Churchill has absorbed. The gap between the size of the American military establishment and its current combat capability, the specific training and combined arms deficiencies that British observers are noting, and the particular quality of American senior military leadership, whose strategic judgment Churchill is privately uncertain about. Brooke's diary entry for June 23, 1942, one of the most candid passages in the most candid private military diary of the war, a document that Brooke himself recognized as potentially explosive if published during the war, and that was indeed published after it, in a form whose honesty about the alliance's tensions historians have been citing and debating ever since, describes a meeting with General George Marshall, who was at that precise moment one of the most consequential military organizers in history, and who would prove, in the subsequent 3 years, to be the man most responsible for the specific institutional transformation of the American army that Churchill had privately doubted was achievable on the required timeline, with a directness that his characteristic understatement makes more rather than less striking. He finds Marshall a pleasant and good-natured man who does not, in Brooke's judgment, have the strategic grasp that the position of American Army Chief of Staff requires. Churchill absorbs this assessment and does not dispute it in his private communications. He has been forming his own view of Marshall through their meetings, and it is not entirely dissimilar to Brooke's, though Churchill brings to his assessment of men a theatrical generosity that Brooke's professional precision does not always match, and Churchill's private communications about Marshall through 1943 and 1944 track the same revision that his assessments of the American military generally undergo, an initial doubt that the evidence of Marshall's organizational achievement progressively and then conclusively overturns. The second subject is the specific strategic disagreement that Churchill engages in with Marshall and the American military staff through the summer and autumn of 1942, a disagreement that Churchill's private communications describe with a specific professional anxiety that his public management of the alliance does not reveal, because the anxiety is about something that the alliance's public face cannot accommodate, the possibility that the Americans, in their eagerness to close with the enemy directly and at the earliest possible moment, will push the alliance into an operation whose failure would set back the entire war effort by years. Churchill's private communications about the sledgehammer debate are among the documents that most clearly reveal the specific quality of his political intelligence, the ability to resist a position he believes is operationally wrong while maintaining the relationship with the ally whose support he cannot do without, to say no in ways that preserve the partnership rather than damaging it, and to manage the diplomatic cost of opposition in ways that the subsequent outcome, the adoption of torch rather than sledgehammer, the success of torch, the validation of Churchill's strategic judgment, eventually recovers. The argument over cross-channel operations, specifically Operation Sledgehammer, that Churchill believes America is pushing too early, before the military preparation that a successful cross-channel assault requires has been achieved, and that he is resisting with the full diplomatic and argumentative resources available to him while publicly maintaining the appearance of Allied unity and shared strategic purpose. Churchill's private communications about the sledgehammer debate are among his most revealing of 1942, because they document both his operational arguments against the proposed cross-channel operation and his private assessment of the American strategic reasoning that is producing the proposal. He finds the American case built on assumptions about the German defensive capability in France and about the Allied military capability to overcome it, that his own experience of what the German military can do tells him are wrong, assumptions that reflect inexperience rather than analysis. His private communications to Brooke express this judgment with a persistence that the formal diplomatic record of the period captures only partially. Churchill believes that sledgehammer would be a catastrophe, and preventing its execution is, in the specific sense of preventing a disaster that could cripple the alliance in its first year of combined operation, the most important strategic objective available to him. He is right. The third, and the one that Churchill's private communications address with the most genuine personal feeling, something close to awe in the specific response of a man who has been calculating military balance sheets in the most desperate conditions, is the emerging American industrial production achievement. The aircraft and ship and tank production rates beginning to reach British planners' desks in the second half of 1942 represent something that exceeds even the optimistic projections that American entry had justified. An industrial mobilization whose scale and speed is producing military output at rates that his own planning assumptions had not projected as achievable on the timeline the Americans are achieving it. What Churchill writes to his war cabinet about American industrial production in the second half of 1942 is the most consistently admiring of his private assessments, the one area where his prior skepticism has been most completely and most rapidly confounded. The Liberty ship program alone, Kaiser's prefabrication methods, producing completed vessels in as little as 4 days at the peak of the program, where British shipbuilding practice measured construction in months, represents a specific and tangible demonstration that American industrial capacity, mobilized for war, operates outside the parameters that any prior experience of industrial mobilization would have allowed Churchill to project. He had anticipated American industrial dominance as a strategic factor. He had not anticipated it becoming operationally relevant on the timeline that American industry's actual performance demonstrates. The first time he describes the American production figures to his war cabinet, with the specific phrasing that his personal astonishment produces, the figures that his staff has assembled from American sources and that British planners have verified against their own intelligence, the room falls quiet, in the way that rooms fall quiet when a number exceeds the scale of available comparison. June 21st, 1942. Tobruk, North Africa. Churchill is in Washington meeting with Roosevelt when the news arrives. The Tobruk garrison, 35,000 men, British and South African and Indian soldiers who have been defending a position that Churchill has assured the House of Commons will be held, has surrendered to Rommel's Afrika Korps in a single day. It is one of the worst blows he sustains during the entire war, and not merely for the military consequence. It falls in front of the American president and the American military establishment at the precise moment when Churchill is trying to argue that the British Army is capable of the operations he is defending, against American pressure to attempt, and it falls with a specific and devastating timing that Churchill describes in his private correspondence as humiliating in a way that the word does not fully convey. Roosevelt's response, asking what he can do, and then personally directing that 300 Sherman tanks be diverted from American Army allocations to British forces in North Africa, is an act of personal generosity that Churchill records in his war memoirs, with the emphasis of a man who knows he is recording something he owes an honest accounting of. But what Churchill writes to Brooke and to his war cabinet in the immediate aftermath of Tobruk is not about Roosevelt's generosity, though the generosity is genuine. It is about the private admission that the public disaster has forced on him, that the British Army in North Africa has specific and serious institutional deficiencies in the combined arms fighting that the German military requires a response to, and that the American military's private assessment of British forces, which is no less critical of British performance than British private assessment is of American, is not wrong in the ways it identifies. The physical image of Tobruk's fall, the 35,000 prisoners, the supplies that Rommel's men are now driving on captured British lorries, the specific and visible humiliation of an army that has been defending a fortress position with a garrison whose size should have made it impregnable for weeks, is one that Churchill carries through the war as the most personal demonstration of the gap between what his army appears to be and what it actually is when the test comes. Tobruk's fall in a single day, despite the garrison's size and the fortifications' reported strength, is the specific kind of military failure that Churchill cannot explain away in his private correspondence. The 35,000 men who have surrendered are the most direct available evidence that the British Army in North Africa has not solved the specific tactical and operational problems that the Afrika Korps has been demonstrating for 18 months. Churchill's private communications to Brooke in the days following the fall describe the specific institutional reforms that the fall makes unavoidable, with a directness that his public communications cannot contain. November 8, 1942. Operation Torch begins. The Anglo-American invasion of Northwest Africa is Churchill's strategic victory, his successful argument against the cross-channel option, and its success in establishing the Allied presence in North Africa validates the specific strategic judgment that Churchill had been arguing for months. What Torch also provides, in its detailed performance data, and in the specific operational experience that the planning and execution of the campaign generates, is the first body of operational evidence about American forces in actual combined arms combat that Churchill can weigh against his prior assessments. He weighs it with the specific honesty of a man who has been waiting for this evidence, and who receives it without the protective filter that public communication requires, and without the defensiveness that would prevent him from using it to update an assessment he formed before the evidence existed. The assessment is mixed in the way that all initial operational evidence from a developing force is mixed. There are specific failures, the coordination problems at Oran, where the landing has cost more than planned and taken longer than expected, the command decisions whose outcomes could have been better, the specific performance gaps that Alexander and Brooks' network of observers are identifying and reporting through November and December 1942, and there are specific achievements that Churchill's private communications acknowledge, with a directness that his public communications manage to a different tone. The achievement that Churchill's private communications address most consistently is organizational and logistical. The ability to plan, resource, and execute a maritime operation of Torch's scale, 3 simultaneous landings across thousands of miles of ocean, supported by the largest Allied naval force assembled to that point, on a timeline that the American military establishment's organizational capability made real, is a capability that British logistical experience, however sophisticated, has not matched in scale. The ships are arriving. The supplies are accumulating. The equipment is of a quality and quantity that British forces in the same theatre have not experienced in their own supply system. Churchill's private assessment of American logistical power through the North Africa campaign is the most genuinely admiring of his private observations about any specific aspect of American military capability in 1942. The near failure that tests Churchill's private assessment of American forces most severely, the moment that comes closest to justifying his 1941 and 1942 skepticism in the most direct way, arrives with the Kasserine Pass disaster in February 1943. Churchill receives the reports of the American collapse in the Western Dorsal, with a private response that his communications to Brooke describe with the specific honesty of a man whose private assessment has been provisionally validated in the worst possible way. He had privately doubted American military readiness. The American force has performed in a way that his private doubt projected, and the performance has simultaneously provided Axis propaganda material and damaged the alliance's military credibility at a moment when the North Africa campaign has not yet reached its decisive phase. What Churchill does not do, and this is the specific characteristic of his private communications about American forces that distinguishes them from a simple record of British condescension toward a junior ally, is allow Kasserine to settle his private assessment. His private communications in the weeks following Kasserine acknowledge the performance failure and simultaneously note the specific and rapid American institutional response that Patton's assumption of 2-Corps command on March 6 and the subsequent dramatic changes in training, discipline, and command tempo represent. Churchill has been managing British military institutional response to failure for 2.5 years. He has found it to be a slow process. What he observes in the American response to Kasserine, Fredendall removed and replaced within 11 days of the defeat, specific performance standards imposed by his replacement, at a speed and directness that the American military's personnel culture enables, more easily than the British, specific training reforms implemented at the pace that operational requirements barely accommodate, is a form of institutional self-correction that his private communications describe, with an admiration that is more significant than political courtesy. It is the specific admiration of a man who has been trying to produce this quality in his own military establishment, and who recognizes in the American version of it something faster and more effective than what he has been able to achieve. By June 6, 1944, when Operation Overlord puts 156,000 Allied soldiers on the beaches of Normandy, in the most complex and ambitious amphibious operation in military history, an operation whose planning has consumed 2 years of Allied staff effort, whose execution has required a deception campaign of unprecedented sophistication, and whose success on the first day is, in Churchill's private communications in the hours after the initial reports arrive, received with a combination of relief and private acknowledgement that the operation he had feared attempting in 1942 was, in 1944, ready to be executed. The private assessment that Churchill has been developing and revising since December 1941 has reached a conclusion that his public communications have come close to, but have never fully expressed, that the American military has become something that he privately underestimated in 1941, and that the intervening 2.5 years of operational experience have demonstrated to be larger, more capable, more institutionally resilient, and more strategically significant than his initial assessment had projected. His private communications in the days and weeks following Overlord's success contain a specific and documented private admission about the American contribution that his public communications, which maintain the carefully balanced emphasis on the joint nature of the operation that coalition politics require, that the British public's sense of national pride requires, and that Churchill's own understanding of the Anglo-American relationship's political dynamics identifies as necessary, do not contain in the same form. General Dwight Eisenhower, commanding the operation, is an American who was a lieutenant colonel when the war began. General Omar Bradley, commanding the American ground forces, is an American whose career trajectory has followed a similar arc through Marshall's specific judgment about his organizational qualities. The American First Army lands on Utah and Omaha beaches with approximately 73,000 men on the first day alone, Utah going as planned, Omaha becoming the specific nightmare of fire and water and death that the German defensive position and the failed preliminary bombardment produce, and being taken anyway by American soldiers who wade through the same water, under the same fire, and continue. The planning staff that has produced the operational plan for the most complex military operation in history is predominantly American, and the logistical infrastructure that will sustain the operation, the Mulberry harbors, the pipeline under the ocean, the supply buildup that will feed an entire army through a beachhead, has been designed and resourced by an American military establishment whose organizational and logistical capability Churchill has been privately admiring since the North Africa campaign made it visible. Churchill's private acknowledgement of these facts is not the acknowledgement of a man who has been proved wrong about everything. He had also been right about things. Right about the cross-channel timing. Right that the 1942 attempt would have been disastrous. Right that the North Africa and Mediterranean campaigns provided the operational preparation that Overlord required. But he had been wrong about the rate of American military development, wrong about the specific ceiling of American organizational capability, and wrong about the institutional quality of American military leadership at the senior levels where he had been most skeptical. He acknowledges this in his private correspondence with a specific and unambiguous honesty that his public orations about the alliance carefully manage to a different register. The specific honesty is worth noting because it is not the honesty that historical reputation automatically credits to the man who was eventually proven right about the large things. It is the smaller and rarer honesty of acknowledging that while one was right about the large strategic questions, one was wrong about the specific and measurable operational questions that turned out to matter as much. Churchill was right about the alliance. He was right about the Mediterranean strategy. He was right about the timing of the cross-channel operation. He was wrong, in ways his private correspondence records without defensive qualification, about the speed and quality and institutional resilience of the force that America was building, and that would ultimately execute the strategic vision that he had correctly identified as the war's necessary outcome. What Churchill privately admitted about American forces, and what he never said in public in exactly this form, is not a single statement, but a pattern of private assessment that evolves across the 4 years of the alliance's operation, from a cautious, anxiety-inflected doubt to a genuine and specifically grounded admiration that is all the more significant for being the product of a mind that had started from a different conclusion and had been moved by evidence. Churchill's 1941 private doubt about American forces is not the doubt of a man who underestimated America from ignorance. He had known America for decades, had American relations and American friendships, had studied the American Civil War's military history with the analytical rigor that his own military writing reveals. It is the doubt of a man who understands the difference between industrial potential and military capability, between the size of a nation's economy and the combat effectiveness of its army, between the abstract possibility of a military establishment and its specific concrete performance in the conditions that modern warfare against a first-class opponent produces. He was right about the distinction. He was wrong about how quickly the gap between America's potential and its performance would be closed, and the private communications that document his acknowledgement of this error, the specific admissions that the operational evidence of 1942, 1943, and 1944 produced in a man who had the intellectual honesty to update his assessment when the evidence required it, are among the most revealing documents of the war's coalition leadership. The private correspondence that documents this evolution is preserved in the Churchill archives at Cambridge, in the published diaries of Colville and Brooke, and in the memoirs that Churchill himself wrote after the war, with the specific advantage of being able to recall what he had privately thought in ways that his public pronouncements had not permitted. The pattern it describes is the pattern of an extraordinarily intelligent and honest man engaging with a reality that is more impressive than he had expected, at a rate he had not projected, producing a military instrument that exceeded the assumptions of his own most optimistic 1941 projections. The specific quality that makes Churchill's private record so valuable for understanding the alliance is that it is not static. It does not fix its assessment at any single point and defend that assessment against the evidence that subsequent events produce. It moves. It revises. It acknowledges what the evidence requires acknowledging, and in that quality of honest intellectual revision, in the willingness of the most formidable political mind of the 20th century to update a major judgment on the basis of what actually happened, rather than managing the judgment toward consistency with what he had initially projected, lies something that goes beyond the historical record of a single war and says something about what intellectual honesty in a leader actually looks like when it is operating under the specific pressure of events that determine the fate of nations. Churchill's public orations about the American military are magnificent in the way that his public orations are always magnificent, precise in their cadences, elevated in their diction, calculated in their effects, and carefully managed in what they reveal and what they protect. They are also, in the specific sense that matters most for understanding the alliance, incomplete. His private communications are more interesting because they track, with the specific candor of private correspondence, the process by which one of history's greatest analysts of power updates his assessment of a new power as the evidence of that power's actual performance accumulates, and because the updating he performs, from anxiety and doubt through grudging acknowledgement to genuine professional admiration, is one of the most honest records available of what it looks like to revise a major judgment on the basis of evidence, rather than manage it on the basis of political necessity. The war was saved, in the specific sense that the defeat of Nazi Germany and the Japanese Empire required a military instrument that Britain alone could not have provided, and that America provided in full, by the American forces that Churchill had privately doubted, in December 1941, and the private record of how a man who doubted them came to understand what they were, is the most honest available account of what the alliance was, and how it worked, and why, at the end, it won.